Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I'm a Dutch Jew and a daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, thinedgeofthewedge.com. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest where the Jews who lived there had parents and grandparents who came from the turn of the century before. So it was a non-Holocaust community, a Holocaust survivor community, except in 1970, my husband and I, a U.S. Army officer, we were stationed in Munich, Germany with the U.S. Army only 25 years after the end of World War II, and this changed our lives forever. Evelyn?
Our guest in today's episode is Manya Brachear Pashman. Manya hosts People of the Pod, an American Jewish Committee podcast about global affairs through a Jewish lens. As a longtime religion reporter for the Chicago Tribune, she reported about two papal transitions from Rome, progress and pitfalls of interfaith dialogue, and the emerging role of religion in American politics. She also served as president of the Religion News Association. Manya earned a bachelor's degree from Appalachian State University and a master's degree in journalism and religious studies from Columbia University. In addition to contributing to the Chicago Tribune, she also writes about anti-Semitism and being Jewish for Religion News Service, The Times of Israel, and Moment magazine. Manya, it's a pleasure to have you on our show, and thank you for coming on, and welcome.
Well, thank you. It is a privilege to be on this show. It's a privilege to talk to you and Phyllis.
Thank you. So, Manya, I have the first question to you. We were wondering what the top stories are about anti-Semitism that you are currently writing on.
So I've written quite a bit about different forms of anti-Semitism and discrimination against Jews this year alone. Some not as obvious as others. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to interview Mayor Bill Peduto of Pittsburgh and Mayor Steve Vaus of Poway, California, who firsthand faced the challenge of fighting anti-Semitism. Of course, Poway and Pittsburgh is where some of the deadliest synagogue attacks have been in America 3 years ago. It's painfully clear to those mayors the importance of fighting anti-Semitism. For Moment magazine, I profiled a Muslim man from Maldives now serving as the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Religious Freedom or Belief, Ahmed Shahid, who, as you may know, he produced the first report devoted to anti-Semitism around the globe, which is kind of stunning that it took decades for someone in that position to produce a report dedicated to the most ancient hatred. Then again, I mean, that may not be fair. I honestly didn't write about it all that much when I covered religion in Chicago, but that was more than 3 years ago. And here in America, at least, it wasn't as much of an issue at that time. It wasn't really newsworthy. Sadly, it's becoming that way. And that is certainly what I've discovered this past year.
Yes. Okay, great. Yeah, those were two important events in the recent history of anti-Semitism. The terrorist attacks in Pittsburgh and Poway, California, and also this remarkable report of this UN rapporteur, I think he is, right, on anti-Semitism.
Exactly. Yeah.
Who advises to use this definition of anti-Semitism that includes criticism of Israel that is crossing the line of anti-Semitism, right?
Right. Yeah, it's more than just a critique of Israeli policy, because certainly everyone has the right, including Israelis, right, to criticize Israeli policy. But it's when you criticize Israel, when you single it out, right, when you protest its very existence, that crosses a line. And I believe you are referring to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that their definition of anti-Semitism, the working definition, it's a really useful tool that I think more and more governments and institutions are realizing what a useful tool it is, as long as you use it properly, right? I mean, it's not to be used as a bludgeon, right? To, as a weapon, absolutely not. It's really a useful resource to use as a guide to determine whether or not something is anti-Semitic. And yeah, I'm really, it's been gratifying to see more and more institutions adopt that and apply it.
Yeah, the applying part is really important.
Thank you, Phyllis. Yes.
because we see a lot of today's anti-Semitism is entangled with criticizing Israel. So where do you put the line? Where is it, legitimate criticism and political criticism, and where does it become anti-Semitism? And that's where this definition is so helpful to determine that.
Very much so. And it really should be determined on a case-by-case basis. I mean, there really is no blanket definition. It has to be, you really have to look at the circumstances of each and every case to determine whether it is a legitimate critique of policy or whether it crosses a line and, questions the, rights of Jews to self-determination.
To survive.
I'm sorry?
To survive, the right of Jews to survive.
Right, exactly. Yeah, to have that haven.
So I have the next question. Is there a reason in your family background or in your own experiences that you are now writing about anti-Semitism?
So that is a complicated question, Phyllis.
This is a conversation.
As is everything in this wheelhouse. So I believe everything happens for a reason. I don't know if that's a Jewish coping mechanism or not, but it works for me. My dream job, my dream home was in Chicago. I covered religion for the Chicago Tribune for 15 years, a little over 15 years. I met my husband there. I had my 2 children there. And then family life became a priority. And unfortunately, my family really couldn't make Chicago work for us. It worked for me, but not for us. And we are in us now. So I left my dream job and moved to New Jersey so that we could all have sustainable careers. And I am Jewish, but was not really raised particularly Jewish. Grew up in Texas and North Carolina. And my parents really loathed organized religion. They have no idea where they went wrong when their daughter became a religion reporter. I mean, they, of course, they didn't go wrong. They just didn't realize that they sparked a curiosity in me about different faiths. In fact, I would say my parents' infinite capacity to love their daughters finally makes sense now that I'm a parent. And it was that capacity and that fierce love and desire to protect their daughters, I believe, that led them to not emphasize our Judaism. I mean, I always had this sense that they believed there was something dangerous about being Jewish. And that said, as a religion reporter, I loved every story I wrote about the Jewish tradition because it ignited this Jewish sensibility within me that didn't happen with other stories. Other stories, ignited my curiosity, but not something within, like the Jewish stories did. So I also say with great shame as a religion writer that I've never been to Israel. Despite many attempts, I have never been. That's a whole other story. But it's not unrelated to my parents' desire to protect their daughters. Again, it was always treated as a dangerous destination.
Wait. I want to know.
Yeah, please.
Were your parents Holocaust survivors?
No, not at all. Not at all. My mother is Jewish, was raised Jewish in Temple, Texas, where on Monday mornings, the teacher would say, okay, stand up if you went to church yesterday. And my mother would slyly stand from her desk because she'd gone to synagogue on Saturday. But she didn't advertise that. It was just a very uncomfortable situation for her. My father grew up in central Illinois in a town called Cornland, and he was not Jewish. He converted after marrying my mom and agreeing to raise their children Jewish. That part didn't really quite work out, but although it did, but accidentally. So yeah, no, they didn't have that. It was a discomfort, Phyllis. It wasn't necessarily that their family members might. We were Eastern European, Russia, Austria, Hungary. That's my history, but not really. We weren't victims of pogroms or anything like that. It wasn't that driving that fear in my family.
So you were telling us you didn't make it yet to Israel, and right? How come?
Right. Because it was treated as a dangerous test. I wanted to go, but my parents discouraged it at every turn. So I have no idea what life is like on the ground there. So all of this, to answer your question, when we moved to New Jersey to raise our family, it was time for me to take a deep dive and really learn as much as I could about Jewish tradition. And frankly, it was also time for me to teach my children how to be Jewish, even when anti-Semitism is truly on the rise here, perhaps especially because anti-Semitism is on the rise. So this professional shift really enables me to do that, enables me to really learn how to be Jewish myself and also how to teach my children how to be Jewish.
That's beautiful.
And maybe make it to Israel at some point.
When COVID allows people to enter again.
Right. When COVID allows us to do anything again.
Right. Manya, from your perspective, as somebody who covers these religious and Jewish topics, what are the most important anti-Semitism situations for which Jews, whether here in the US or elsewhere, need to be paying attention?
Oh, wow. Evelyn, where do I start? It's just coming from so many different directions. And that is certainly something that I've learned doing this job for the past 2.5 years. As a journalist, the rise of misinformation, right? And misinformation campaigns on social media, that's alarming. As a Jewish journalist, it's downright frightening. The death of facts gives life to fiction, I like to say. And when I say fiction, I mean in the form of conspiracy theories. And we saw a slice of that, or what can happen when people start to believe those conspiracy theories. We saw a slice of that on January 6th. As we saw in Pittsburgh and Poway 3 years ago, the rise of white nationalism from the right in this country is deadly, for Jews especially. And I think that's probably the most dangerous situation. I think that's where the most danger is coming from at this point. But as we saw across the country in May, when Israel was under attack by terrorists, and by the way, Evelyn, I appreciate you using the word terrorist to describe who attacked Pittsburgh and Poway too. Those were terrorists too. But when Israel was under attack by terrorists in Gaza, we saw this kind of general disgust with Israel from the left that prompted attacks on American Jews whose only crimes were walking to synagogue or dining outdoors wearing a kippah, right? I mean, who knows if they'd even been to Israel or how they felt about Israel. They were still attacked for being Jewish. In Europe, we're seeing countries like Germany, for example, open its doors to refugees, but struggling to keep Hamas and Hezbollah from radicalizing the fringes of these groups that are trying to integrate into society and wreaking utter havoc. we're seeing social media platforms and college campuses, both the quads and the classrooms, right, becoming quite uncomfortable for Jewish students. And I think it's a level of discomfort beyond what my mother suffered in those classrooms in Temple, Texas, right? I mean, it's like severe discomfort and fear, right? That's a problem. That's a real problem, not just for Jewish students, but for all of the college graduates who are coming out of the university completely unsure of what they're going to do with their lives, but damn certain they know who's right and who's wrong in the Middle East because of the memes they pass around on Instagram, right? So that's a problem. And so you ask, what are the ones that we need to be paying? What are the situations we need to be paying attention to? It's a really hard question.
Right.
I don't know where to point you.
Right. And you mentioned, and I think rightfully so, a lot of angles from which anti-Semitism is reaching us these days, here in America, but also in Europe and elsewhere in the globe. It's coming from the white supremacists who are becoming stronger. Also, when there is more mass immigration going on in the world, and you get populists who oppose that, and then in the wings, in the fringes of that comes white supremacy. So we see that globally. We see anti-Semitism coming from the left when it's like passionate criticism of Israel, and then it starts to cross the line in many cases, and especially young people face that in classrooms and on campuses also. We see misinformation on social media, as you said, big time, right? When the conflict flares up between Israel and Hamas, then we immediately see a bombardment of misinformation on social media concerning Israel, which demonizes it as an apartheid state and a genocidal state, which is not true, factually untrue. And we see, especially in Europe, problems between Muslims and Jews, Muslim immigrants who, there is much more anti-Semitism in the Muslim population in the world than there is in any other population in the world. So Muslim immigrants bring that, not all of them, but a lot of them bring that with them and clash with Jewish communities in their new country. And I have personally been I would say, a victim of that. So you give a very, it's a sad, but it's a realistic overview of what's coming towards Jewish people today. Phyllis, you are looking.
The question is, what can we do about these situations? And just to mention, sitting here in my apartment looking out at Beverly Hills, this Sunday, right before Hanukkah, houses in a certain part of Beverly Hills got flyers on their lawn with a flyer that was against Jews. It was in a plastic bag with rice to keep it from flying off the lawn. And the articles will not print what was said exactly, because that I think that's correct, because it's propagating hate speech, but basically blaming Jews for everything bad in COVID. I mean, just total conspiracy, and probably timed Hanukkah. So, I mean, what are you supposed to do? Someone reported it right away to the police, but I mean, what do we do about these situations?
Yeah, well, that's a $50 million question, right? I mean, if we had the answer, I'd be writing about something else. I'd go back to writing about Catholics all the time, like I did in Chicago. It just being a largely Catholic city. I mean, that is my solution, is to write about it, right? I mean, we all have our own way of trying to fight it and trying to combat it. I mean, I think that So I spent the morning at my daughter's Montessori school with jelly donuts, and actually it was donut holes and a squeegee bottle of grape jelly, just in case they didn't like jelly donuts, to make the holiday meaningful for little kids. And told the story about the miracle of Hanukkah, but slipped in hopes that they would understand, although I don't really think they did, slipped in that there are two miracles we celebrate on Hanukkah. One is that the oil that was only supposed to last one day lasted for 8. But the other miracle is that this tiny band of committed believers beat this huge Greek army, and the victory meant religious freedom, really, quite frankly, for all of us. I mean, that's what they were fighting for, was religious freedom. Yes, in their case, it was for Jews. But, religious freedom is something that we all enjoy here in America. And that's really what Hanukkah is about. And all they could think about were the donuts. But I felt like I had done my part, right, of making Hanukkah, kind of imbuing it with meaning, and especially relevant meaning now. Using these opportunities to highlight, first of all, highlight Jewish contributions to society, and so that people know that and are aware of that, recognize that, appreciate that, but also, highlighting just the that even thousands of years ago we were fighting, hatred and misunderstanding, and for the freedom to worship and live and survive, as you said, Phyllis. But I think that, like I said, that's my solution, is to write about it, shine a light, give voice to it, put a human face on these dangers, both real and perceived dangers, to educate students, journalists, educators, that, anti-Semitism, it's not just a Jewish problem, it's a societal problem.
Exactly.
It's a symptom of a very broken society, that when all else fails, blame the Jews, right? When the chaos seems to defy explanation, make something up, find a villain who's responsible. And, there's a long history of that for the Jewish people. But we have to know history. We have to understand people's histories, not just Jewish, everybody's history. We have to understand that and respect that. And we have to figure out how we're going to repair the world. We can't repair history, too late for that, but we can try not to repeat it, and we can try to avoid, repeating the tropes and the patterns that have driven anti-Semitism for thousands of years. And that just education is, I think, just the key to that.
That's what we believe in, Evelyn.
Yes, I agree with you, Manya, that especially what you said, understanding people's history, people's history, is so important in bringing a human face to a person, to a group of people, and I think in the anti-Semitic criticism of Israel today, you can see that many of the people who criticize in that way have no idea about the history. They don't understand even why the state of Israel was established and how it built on, right? Noah Tishby's book explains that.
Simple, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Simple guide, the most misunderstood country on earth.
Yeah. So, and that there is already millennia of Jewish history in Israel. Like if it landed there suddenly in 1948, which is not at all the case. So now I agree that knowledge about history and education about history, also about the Holocaust, very important, and it's missing more and more, is important to make people understand what they can do to prevent that in the future.
Yeah.
And we appreciate your writing, to educate people in that respect. And I also agree that everybody has his own or her own way to to do something against anti-Semitism. You write, I made a documentary, Phyllis wrote a play, and publishes blogs. You know, we all have our, and we started this podcast. You are doing a podcast, the People of the Pot, of the American Jewish Committee, which not only but also pays attention to the rising anti-Semitism in the world. So, you know, people do all kinds of things, and again, I hope that together we make a statement, right? And change something. Better than doing nothing, that's for sure.
Yes.
So,
Right.
Manya, do you believe that American Jewish organizations are paying enough attention, and also are paying the right kind of attention to the rising tide of anti-Semitism?
So I certainly see a lot of American Jewish organizations responding to it. I really honestly can only speak to what American Jewish Committee is doing. So I don't pretend to know the machinations of other American Jewish organizations. They certainly seem to be paying a lot of attention and responding to anti-Semitism. I also don't pretend to know the machinations of AJC, but it's really, I can only speak to what American Jewish Committee is doing. I will say, as a religion reporter, as a Jewish religion reporter, I do now admit that I was clueless. I was completely oblivious to many of the anti-Semitic terms that are out there. I've learned so much vocabulary from my time at AJC, vocabulary that I'm never supposed to use, but at least now I know what those words are, not to use them. I've learned a lot about the complexities of Israel on the ground. I've learned a lot about the people, the motives behind the curtains of some of the anti-Israel movements that as a reporter, I just didn't know. I probably should have, but I didn't. And so I would like to think that if I'm learning these things, then our audience is also learning these things. So I do think AJC does a good job of just shining a light and explaining these elements, just being a resource. AJC is really trying to address some of the tough questions that are out there. Whether it's, why should the United States replenish the Iron Dome defense system in Israel? Or why can't I be critical of Israel's policies without being called anti-Semitic? Well, the answer is you can and you won't be, as long as you stick to legitimate criticism of Israel's policies. But I think that AJC has done a good job of just being a resource and explaining those things. And I think that's really what people want. They just want explanations, rational, reasonable explanations for things. That's probably giving people too much credit, but I do. That's what I want. It's just rational, reasonable explanations for things, and I think that that's really what AJC aims to provide. We want to be a resource. I think that's what people need. They don't need someone telling them what to think or do. They just need explanations and knowledge.
So you
Do you feel that?
Go ahead, Evelyn.
Do you feel that counters the misinformation about Israel, the demonization of Israel on social media?
Well, it's hard to counter that. They have the power of algorithms on their side and a lot of other things. But I think that that's certainly what we're trying to combat, right? I mean, we're trying to combat fiction with fact, and get out there and put out content, whether it's explanations, Q&As, interviews, articles, podcasts, that kind of thing. We are trying to put out the truth, that's for sure. It'll be interesting. Another kind of wing of AJC, we are very active on Capitol Hill, right? I mean, in terms of advocacy and not lobbying, but just advocacy and teaching lawmakers, fact from fiction. And I think that one of the things that we're advocating for is, some regulation on social media, some accountability, and not censorship. There's a difference between accountability and censorship. And I think that accountability is a big goal that AJC is, a lot of my colleagues are working toward.
You did. So I was going to ask you the question about suggestions of what individuals can do about speaking up. And in a way, you provided it by saying that AJC helps to educate. So
Mhm.
if we as individual Jews are better prepared on these issues, then we have more kind of tools in, in our toolkit of how to answer some of these things in a calm way that perhaps can get across to other people. So that's good, the more that we all know. So what would be your last thoughts to tell our audience?
So, well, I will tell you why I work for AJC, or how I came to work for AJC. And that is, when I was a religion reporter, I wasn't a big fan of inflammatory folks. Like, I usually did try to go to the rational, reasonable folks who really explained things to me in diplomatic terms. I wasn't about fanning the flames. I really did want people to read what I wrote and understand better whatever it was I was writing about. And AJC was always my go-to for that. I had someone there in Chicago who she just was a wonderful explainer and diplomatic. And whenever I had questions, I would go to her for quotes and feedback and input. And so that's one of the reasons why I came to work for AJC, is kind of that diplomatic, rational, reasonable approach. It's why I felt comfortable working and learning here. I would say that, though, you were saying you were going to ask me, how do people speak up about this? And I think that, honestly, not a lot of people are speaking up, right? I mean, do just that, speak up.
Right.
Not all anti-Semitism is violent. Some of it is quite subtle. But it's all underreported. And I think that is very, very important. Would you believe that, like, I think it was Miami, Syracuse, is it Anaheim, Grand Rapids, those cities and like dozens of others reported 0 hate crimes in 2020.
No.
0.
Right.
You're right. Right? I mean, that does not reflect reality. The reality is that people don't feel it will do any good to report a hate crime, or that there's just no reliable mechanism to count hate crimes in their community. Yet crimes against Jews top the hate crimes based on religion. More than half of the hate crimes based on religion are against Jews, who are 2% of the population. So don't feel guilty, or don't feel like hear you if you speak up about anti-Semitism. Call it out, and call it out whether you're Jewish or not, and whether you're speaking to people who are Jewish or not. I mean, like I said before, it is a societal problem. It is not just a Jewish problem. It's a global phenomenon. And as a Jewish mother, I take that very seriously. I take these dangers that my parents internalized. I take them very seriously. And it's a threat to our democracy. And as a journalist, I take that seriously as well. So speak up.
That's the purpose of our show, to teach people and encourage people to speak up. So with that, I thank you so much, Manya. This has been a wonderful conversation. I thank our listeners. I encourage everyone who hasn't yet seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, to see it on YouTube or Amazon. And you can read more about my free theater project at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And to repeat once again, is what we always say at the end of our show, if you can do it without the risk of physical harm, everyone, please speak up against anti-Semitism and hate.